Ironically, Randy is our guest speaker. We all know Randy. We always see him out mowing his lawn when we drive by his house when we're going on up to Fife Brook. He's a great fisherman, but what a lot of us don't know what he does for a living. And he is an extension weed specialist with the University of Massachusetts. He works with agricultural producers, green industry professionals, and land managers to solve a variety of weed problems. We've had, especially since Irene, a lot of invasive plants popping up in the watershed. And we do get questions here and there from anglers, mostly about knotweed. So we thought this would be a good opportunity, since we have an expert on our own board, to hear from Randy about some of these invasive plants and what we might as a chapter be able to do someday to be able to combat them. Randy.
Thanks, Mike. Mike asked me to do this, and my first reaction is, sure, I need a new hat. So my hat is pretty grungy. So yeah, this is my third Zoom presentation of the day. So I'll be sleeping well tonight. But I just want to take you through some of the stuff about invasive plants, a little bit of background, and then pretty much 3 sections. A little bit of background on invasive plants. Why are they invasive? What do they do? Take you through some of our biggest invasives that we see on the river, show you where they are, show you some pictures of them, and then have a brief discussion at the end where if invasive plants is something we need to manage, we decide that's a priority to us, what are our opportunities, things that we may be able to help with, and things that we should probably run like the wind when it comes to certain things that people may ask us to do. So what is a weed? Subjective. Scientists hate subjective. And that's where, let me move this bar because it just drives me nuts here. There we go. A plant growing where it's not desired, a plant out of place, higher plants which are a nuisance. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a plant whose virtues have yet to be discovered. Most weed scientists would ask Ralphie to stay in his lane. We really hate that definition because it means if you take a weed and you find 1 or 2 good characteristics for it, that instantly it's not a problem in the environment or in agriculture. You make dandelion wine or dandelion salad greens, and all of a sudden it's not a problem in no-till corn and pasture. Well, it's not that easy. So I think we'd like to ask him to please stay with his poetry and his writing and leave the weed science to us plant geeks. Objective, we love objective. The best definition, the Weed Science Society of America. Weed Science Society of America, proud card-carrying member. A weed is a plant that causes economic losses or ecological damage, creates health problems for humans and animals, or is undesirable where it is growing. There was a whole subcommittee that actually worked on this, and I highlighted in here the word. This was not an original definition 20 years ago, the ecological damage, and that's where we really start to pay attention as a science society about invasive plants. So invasive plants, the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group, which after 21 years serving on that committee, I am considered a ranking member, member of institutional knowledge. Do you remember when 18 years ago we voted on this? I'm like, 18 years ago, I got a hard time remembering what I did 18 minutes ago, let alone 18 years ago. But this is the definition that the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group: non-native species that have spread into native, natural, or minimally managed plant systems in Massachusetts. They cause economic and environmental harm by developing self-sustaining populations and becoming dominant and disruptive in those ecosystems. The key word are dominant and disruptive. And just to give you an idea of what dominant and disruptive, this is kudzu in North Carolina. This is just west of Greensboro as you head in towards Asheville. Pretty much everything in that picture that's green, except for a couple treetops here, a couple treetops up here, and this grass right along the edge of the road. This was another vacation. I'd go on vacation. I'd take 10,000 pictures, and maybe like two of them have people in them. And if the people are there, they're only there for scale. Stand next to that so people can see how big it is. So that's dominant and disruptive. More kudzu in the south. So some of the traits, the easiest way to think about it is when I do some talks to like garden clubs or master gardeners, I'll say it's a weed and they'll say it's a wildflower. And the easiest way I get around that is say that a weed is an ugly wildflower and a wildflower is a good looking weed. So we look at invasive plants, the characteristics. All invasive plants are weeds, but not all weeds are invasive plants. And one of the big things that separates out there, it has to be non-native to be invasive. So some characteristics, they're prolific producers of fruit and therefore seed. Many of them have effective dispersal mechanisms. Birds eat the seed and then they, go somewhere and roost. What's the first thing a bird does before it takes off? It lightens the load, and there may be some weed seeds in there that drop to the ground and take off. Effective establishment, sometimes in really rough conditions, they grow much quicker than most of our native plants. They become aggressive competitors, often dominating our native vegetation. Some species have a longer growing season. They actually leaf out earlier, giving them a competitive photosynthetic advantage. And then if you're familiar with Norway maple, right now they're full yellow. Most of our native trees, the maples and the oaks and the birches, beeches hang on to their leaves forever when they're brown. But Norway maple is still bright yellow right now, and they would be green probably up until 3 weeks ago, while most of our other plants have already turned color. And one characteristic that is very important to realize is that a lot of these non-native plants, whether they were introduced accidentally or through the nursery trade, and we'll talk about some that were introduced through the nursery trade like Norway maple, they have few natural insect predators or plant diseases. In their native range where they came from, sometimes they're not that big of a problem because they have an insect that feeds on them, slows their population, or they have disease problems. But when they come here, those problems are left in their native range. When I was in Japan, as part of an exchange program that we have with the University of Massachusetts and Hokkaido, which is our Hokkaido University, with our daughter school, I asked to see some Japanese knotweed. And they took me on a 3-mile ride into the middle of nowhere. And they said, here it is. And it's one plant barely 2 feet tall. I'm like, well, you could have just described it. They're kind of small. They have an insect that feeds really strongly on it. And many of our nursery plants, whether they're Norway maple, barberry, or burning bush, when they were brought here and sold as nursery plants for landscape, they were touted as being sustainable, low input, because they didn't have those problems. So they were sold as being something you want because you don't have to worry about insects or diseases. And when they get wild, there's nothing to control them naturally that would normally control them in their range. So I'll talk about some of the most common ones that we see along our river. Phragmites. Common name is common reed, but most of the time we just refer to it as Phragmites, which is the genus. Anybody's ever driven the New Jersey Turnpike in the vicinity of the Meadowlands, there's thousands of acres of Phragmites in that area. It's a concern because it gets dry in the winter, and if it ever caught on fire, they suspect that it would disrupt air traffic at Newark International, Liberty International, LaGuardia, and JFK due to smoke. Roadside in Granby, Massachusetts. This is looking downriver from the East Charlemont boat ramp. You can see that population right there. Just upriver over here. This is all Japanese knotweed, so they kind of battle it out right about here. Wilcox Hollow, there's a couple populations in Wilcox Hollow. Wilcox Hollow is an invasive plant hunter's paradise. Occasionally I'll go down there and just look for invasive plants. Yeah, I need a life. I really do. I should be fishing probably instead of looking for invasive plants, but I can't help it. I've been down there. There's purple loosestrife down there. There's pretty much everything that I'm going to show you coming up. There's Ampelopsis, there's black swallowwort, there's pale swallowwort down there. Combination of that whole section where it comes out of when it comes out behind the ball fields in Shelburne Falls there, right up to the potholes, river right, river left, all the way down to the number 2 dam, within, 50 yards on either side of the river. A lot of natives, but there's also some populations of some invasives in there. Another population, this is from the top of Fife, right in here. The path goes to the parking area down here. You come into here, right in here, there's a population of Phragmites. I was taking this picture the other day, and of course, wouldn't you know it, somebody had to come through the gate and had to play 21 questions with me. And I explained who I worked for and what I was doing. I was taking a picture of that weed. And, I guess he didn't think I was much of a threat. So he said, have a great day. Hope your students enjoy the picture. So please tell me you're enjoying this picture. So I can not feel like I lied. Barberry. Barberry is a very common along our river. It doesn't make the thick masses that we sometimes see in other forest ecosystems. This is a purple one. This is the one that's in the trade, purple leaf one. But like many things that are purple leaf or yellow leaf, when they produce seed and grow out, they revert back to the green stage. This is a purple one. I just noticed this. I took this picture. This is a bicycle over here. Never noticed that. Or am I like, I never noticed that, but it's a bicycle, isn't it? Or am I just delirious after all day of Zoom? It's not a bicycle. It could be one. So
I don't know if you're qualified to identify bicycles, Randy, but
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. It's an invasive bicycle. It doesn't belong there. So this is population in Eastern Mass in the Boylston area, Cyprian Keys, forest understory, and impenetrable thicket. Show you some pictures of, here's a forest understory. This shows a spring picture of it all leafing out earlier than many of our native trees, giving that competitive advantage I discussed before. This is river right above the Zor Gap, about halfway between the center of the Zor Gap and the takeout. Right now, the green ones are turning, not really red. The bright red is probably burning bush in the woods, but they turn kind of a palish red, almost sometimes pink. And then this is Cascade Brook. Here's Cascade Brook back in here. And this is Peanut Road is right behind me taking this picture here. This is the Hoosick Tunnel over here to the left. And Cascade Brook is that stream that comes out next to the tunnel and runs in right underneath the trestle. A lot of times this time of the year, it's really easy to see a lot of these invasive plants because they change the specific color and they do hold their leaves a little bit later than a lot of our native trees and shrubs. Multiflora rose, introduced as a living fence and also as an ornamental, but a lot of these plants, some of them, including autumn olive, which fortunately we don't have a ton of on the watershed, they were introduced as a wildlife plant from the soil and water conservation districts, where they gave farmer these free plants to help the bees and help the birds. And oftentimes some of these plants that were distributed with good intention to help wildlife and help the birds and wildlife, they were fine. I mean, there's a lot of vitamin C here in these in the fruit of rose, but if they were brought in and they didn't have something to keep them in check, they kind of got away. Multiflora rose, Les Merhoff took this picture. This is an old abandoned site, pretty much full of multiflora rose. This is early spring green up. I didn't realize didn't have this picture in there for that, but this is sometime Easter in Hadley, walking down through one of the farm fields in the river in North Hadley, and you can see it start to leaf out ahead of many of the other things that are still not green at that point. So now we'll move into the two big ones. Oriental bittersweet, Celastris urbiculatus. A lot of people want to call this kudzu. Kudzu of the north maybe, but it's certainly not even a relative. It's just a big vine that grows and they don't know what it is. They want to call it honeysuckle because they know certain honeysuckles are vines. So that's Oriental bittersweet. Urbiculatus. We were talking about Latin before. All this scientific names, urbiculatus. They're round leaves. All this Latin means something. Acer rubrum. Guess what that is? That'd be red maple. It makes it a little bit easier. So growth habits, really determined management, determined by the growth habit. They could be climbing vines that will go to the top of huge trees. Some of the most impressive vines is right across from Gould Sugar House on Route 2. You're looking across the field and you're looking down towards the number 2 dam, the impoundment at Wilcox Hollow. And you will see these vines up in the top of the trees, or they could be a shrubby ground cover. If there's nothing for them, they could grow as like a impenetrable thicket that's maybe 3 to 6 foot tall, just a tangle of vines if there's nothing for it to crawl on. So there's 2 different species. The one on the left is Oriental bittersweet. That is non-native, classified as invasive. Let me change my pen color. Round leaves, has the round leaves. And the flowers, and therefore the fruit, come out of the axils, the leaf axils. This one is not coming out of a leaf axil. We'll just assume that the leaf fell off. That's non-native and invasive. There's another species that is not very common in our area. It's the native American bittersweet, Celastris scandens. Those leaves are more ovate, strap-like, and the leaf clusters and therefore the flowers are all terminal. You'll see this in gardens sometimes. You'll see this in like when you go into an Ocean State job lot and you see a little cardboard boxes with a vine in them. And the Department of Agricultural Resources has a regulation on some of these plants. And they get calls, oh, they're selling it. And it's the American bittersweet. So they are allowed to sell the American bittersweet still in Massachusetts, but not the Oriental bittersweet. So why do some Oriental bittersweet vines have tons and tons of berries and others do not? You have probably been wondering that all along as you look at these things. Another place you can look for that is right across from Gould Sugar House. As you look up, if you cross the road and stay at that hayfield, on the upriver side, on the right, on the west side, you'll see vines that are just full of berries and those that don't have any berries on them. And so now here, the moment you've all been waiting for is why do some have berries? Because this vine is polygamodioecious, and polygamodioecious, a plant with staminate flowers and bisexual in one individual and pistillate flowers and bisexual flowers in other individuals. So take a look here on this. It's not really, it's a shrub, but we'll pretend it's Oriental bittersweet. You got a female right there. And then you have a flower that's female and also has male structures. Over here, this is a flower that has straight, scribble, scribble, is straight male flower, and this has male plus, my handwriting is horrible with a mouse, male plus female flowers. So functionally, they're dioecious, because in this plant over here, these male structures probably are just vestiges of they're probably not functional. Over here, these female structures, they may be in the flower, but they don't work. So essentially you have male and female plants because they're functionally dioecious. Best example of a dioecious plant that you're probably most familiar is hollies, American holly. If you just have one holly and it's a female, you won't have berries. Oftentimes when you landscape, you put two females, like if you're looking down on a ornamental bed here, I got to draw with white because drawing on black with black doesn't give me anything. Is ornamental bed, you would put a male in the back, to be your male, and you jam two females in the front and all let them grow together because you need a pollen source for these two females in the front. So that's dioecity. So that's about Oriental bittersweet. Let's move into Japanese knot. We probably are number one. If we have to look at what's our number one invasive in our watershed, it's Japanese knotweed. One of the things I commonly hear, and we kind of do some Mythbuster stuff, but that was one of my favorite shows. Too bad it went away. But a lot of times people say, well, it's a good bank stabilizer. And actually, it's not a good bank stabilizer. It reproduces by rhizomes. Those rhizomes are not very deep down in the soil. Most of them are in the top foot, maybe foot and a half. And when you get erosion on a bank, water will get underneath that mat, take the soil out. It's mostly rhizomes. There's little root hairs on it, the rhizomes, and they'll just peel away. Right before Hurricane Irene, right across the street from me, there was about 3 acres. Hurricane Irene took it all away. It's somewhere between across the street from me and Long Island Sound. I think a lot of it piled up in the center of Shelburne Falls against the bridge to flowers. I mean, it was just a huge amount, and that's why we see it propagate vegetatively through those rhizomes. So the best name, Japanese knotweed. You might hear Japanese bamboo. Bamboos are grasses. This is a broadleaf plant. It's in the same family with rhubarb and buckwheat. And then Mexican knotweed and Mexican bamboo. It originates from Japan and other parts of Asia. Mexico, I don't know how Mexico ever got involved in this, but it's from Japan and other parts of Asia. Scientific names, I use Polygonum cuspidatum. That's an old name, but it's still acceptable. You may see Rhaenutria japonica and Fallopoeia japonica. Fallopoeia because of the hollow stems. Back up so you can see the hollow stems here. I learned the hard way that teaching undergraduate students this scientific name kind of makes them giggle, and you got to do it right before the end of the class because there's no bringing them back. One of our populations on the UMass campus is down behind, back in the distance here is 116. This is down by the Moen Center. Behind here is the Mill River, which comes out of Puffer's Pond. It goes in as Cushman Brook, it goes through Puffer's Pond, and then it becomes Mill River, goes down to the center of North Amherst, crosses into Hadley, and works its way into Mount Water Lake, and then into Connecticut River. This is what we are proud as our County Fair Blue Ribbon winnering population at the University of Massachusetts. Early spring emergence. They come back from the rhizomes, they brown off. About this time of the year, they'll be brown and they'll spring up in the spring. Usually the first time you see this, you'll see that they come up as purple leaves. Usually you start to see the emergence. If it's in a warm spot, you can see it by the middle of April, end of April, but usually by the middle of May, you really start to see the small purple leaves come up and then they elongate quite quickly. This is a shot. Les Merhoff took this many, many years ago. This is the island behind upriver from Crabapple, where the little turnout is there. And this is a rock. I know you fishermen, you have seen a rock before. This population was controlled at one point. Power company had problems with these stems breaking off and washing into the number 4. And during periods of high water, the stems would break off. Or if anybody's ever seen this with ice, you'll see the big ice, just crush the dry stems, and they were dealing with vegetation moving down. So this was controlled. It was almost clean, and they should have came back. Of course, with weed management, especially with invasives, I always try to get people who I'm consulting with and helping is to understand the difference, that weed management is not an event, it is a program. Doing something once is probably not enough. You have to have a program that's a multiple different steps. And that's where we talk about our opportunities, maybe where we could, we may be able to contribute to some of those steps. Determine what your resource is that you want to protect. Determine what's the greatest threat as far as an invasive plant to that. Do your research, figure out what it takes to control, build a plan, treat it, evaluate what's going on. If you determine what your threat is and you determine what you're going to do and your resources don't match, it's not realistic, you need to recalibrate to make it realistic. And then look at the plan. I try to get people away from, here's the plan, we're just going to keep doing the plan whether it works or not. You need to take a look at that plan and say, well, it's not working. So I stopped the other day, and that's that same island. There's that rock. This is obviously pre-Irene. This is how whenever I used to fish before I lived up here, I would know if the water was high, I could see that rock. At low water, you can just, water runs over that rock at low water. At high water, it just complete. There's that same rock. There's where Chris Jackson lives over here, in case you didn't know. There's that rock. But you can see that island, and then also all up river left. You see some up here in the up here. That is probably the most knotweed there is, between the number 4 impoundment up to probably the center of Charlemont. Both sides of the river are pretty much full of Japanese knotweed. Some of this is probably the Japanese knotweed that left across the river from me during Irene. There may have been rhizomes that moved downstream from that. So talk about management. The standard program that I use and most of my colleagues will use in weed science, other extension specialists recommend, is applications early in the season don't do anything for us. There's somebody say, well, we'll get it when it's young and tender and coming out of the ground, but that just stunts it. And the last thing you want to do with a weed that you're trying to control is put an herbicide on that doesn't work and stunt it and have it regrow out, because you effectively piss it off. And when you piss off a weed, it just seems like it grows all that more. So these are late summer applications of a glyphosate-based product, and they are used from the sign of first bud formation, where you start to see the flower clusters start to develop, through the first hard frost. We could have some, I call them car or metal frosts, where you get frost on the hood of your car, on the top of your car, and your glass, but it's not on the ground. You could have a couple of those. As long as your leaves are still at least 75% green, you still have enough green material there. So the standard recommendation is you go in and cut it down to the ground in late May and early June. If it's large areas, I like a flail mower. A rotary mower is good, but flail mower chops stuff up. The goal in cutting in the end of May and early June. The reasons for that is it removes the previous year's those dry stems that are very sharp. And if you fall, they're probably going to leave a mark. They're hard to wade through. Remove some of the plant's energy. As that plant starts to grow in the spring from its rhizomes, it uses some of that energy to push out that new growth that I showed you, that 3-4 foot. This mowing, Japanese knotweed, May and June, around here, it's probably usually 3 or 4 foot tall at that point. Remove some of that energy so the plant has to use more resources in the rhizomes to push out new leaves. So that slows the plant weakens a little bit. And then it'll be a shorter height when it regrows. The next picture is a picture that I got from a colleague of mine at Penn State. In the back, you can see Japanese knotweed that is not mowed. It's in full flower. That's your indicator. That's your phenological indicator. And in the front, this is waist high. This may have been cut a little bit later, maybe the end of June or July, because it's only waist high. It's easier for the applicator to get in and treat that. You don't have those dry stems, the stems from the previous years. Even this population down here that's being treated, we change colors again, doesn't have to be flowering. It's the timing. It's a lot of broadleaf plants and perennials. As you get later in the season, post-flowering, up until flowering, all the energy in that plant is going to produce flowers and the fruit. Once it's there, then it starts removing energy back down into the underground roots, into the rhizome, and you get a better move of herbicides into that rhizome system like this. And then as the days get cooler, they start storing energy in their rhizomes, in their tap roots, in their root systems or their crowns for overwintering. And you get a better flow. You have a better net flow of sugars downward, and the herbicide moves with those sugars. So where might TU get involved? I think, you know, kind of determine some target populations, and those populations based on size. This makes sense. This is just way beyond what anybody should be tackling. Start small. One of my favorite movies is What About Bob? Baby steps, Bob, baby steps, baby steps. You know, start out with small technical support to landowners and the contractor that's doing the work. There are a couple companies, one very good company out of the Montague area, another one out of Athol. There's one out of South Berkshire County. I think her office is actually in Sheffield or Great Barrington. The technical support for the landowners, I put my RGP next to that because that's what I do for a living. There may be physical components. If a landowner decides they want to do this, we may be able to help with some of the physical components. Maybe that if it's not a large, it's the whack down the end of May and June to get ready for an application. This may be a way of the company being more willing to treat that. And then in the restoration phase, we certainly have done restoration phases. And that's once this is controlled after a 2 or 3 year period, depending on what the invasive is, the person wants the landowner wants to revegetate that, put some trees in there towards the end of the project. And we still watch for these to come back. You know, planting trees, if they bought trees, it may be whips where you poke a hole with a crowbar, you stuff the root in there and you put the crowbar next and you pry it over and you do, you know, do bare whips. You do a bare root whips or something. There's no role for us to be used in herbicide applications. One, you'd have to be licensed. And two, most of these populations that are going to be Wetland Protection Act jurisdictional. So they would need to go through the Conservation Commission because they would be jurisdictional. And where really hard, most applicators kind of shy away from this because with the conservation, once determination of applicability, notice of intent, and order of conditions. Your order of conditions is your permit. and that gets filed with the registry, the county registry of deeds, as a, for lack of a better term, a lien against the property. That's how they put the teeth in the Wetland Protection Act, because if you decide you're going to take on one of these projects and you make a mess, you need to have a clear deed. And if you have something registered against the deed, like if you had a home equity line, you need to pay that off before you sell your house. So I see more of a overall, I think that if you look at the first three things here, more of a supportive role and assist as we can. I certainly don't think it's wise with the other things that we're doing to adopt, adopt an invasive plant population and try to get rid of it all by itself. I see that there's a supporting role where maybe able to offer some support as assistance, or maybe small segments or small phases of a project if we were concerned on doing this at all. And yes, that is me. Her name's Abby. Actually helped deliver her. I wanted to name her Abraham because we had just learned about Abraham Lincoln, and my grandfather pointed out that it's a girl cow. So we went with Abby. Thank you all. Any questions? Any questions other than I have a weed in my garden and it has green leaves? Do you know what it is? I don't play that game because I don't do well at it.
Randy, if you have a small area with invasives, would mowing it 2 or 3 times a year or regularly, would that eventually take care of it?
Yeah, it depends on what species it is. It depends on when we're gonna, that's a strategy that's very common. If we don't want to, it's a small population, and the thing that's most important is how big the population, because that's going to drive what's possible physical.
Mhm.
When we continually mow a plant, we do it over and over again. That strategy is called carbohydrate starvation, where you continually remove the top growth and the green leaves. It can't photosynthesize, and any new growth has to come from the stored energy in the root system or in the rhizomes. And so there's Japanese knotweed. That's probably a mowing in the spring when it gets to 4 or 5 inches, and then you're never allowing Japanese knotweed to get above 4 or 5 inches. You're constantly defoliating it. That strategy may take 6 or 7 years. And usually the way that goes, when you talk to someone who doesn't want to use an herbicide, you'd explain all that. And then the last thing they say is, now, if I was going to spray it, what would I use? I wish we had jumped right to that in the beginning, because that's where we always end up. Requires incredible amount of diligence. Almost like you can't go away for, more than 10 days, because you have to be right on it. We also get into certain non-chemical herbicides like acetic acid, which is the active ingredient in vinegar, where we cut stuff down, and that's a foliar burn. We have people use steam cleaners to anything that removes the top growth. The perfect example of that is if you cut down a tree along a roadside, is people are doing right-of-way work should be taking that cut surface and treating it with an herbicide to prevent it from resprouting, because then you get all these little sprouts and you get a shrub rather than kill the trunk. If you let all those little suckers come up around that trunk, it'll eventually grow into a multi-stem big shrub. But if you keep clipping them, the plant can only do that for so long. So yeah, that's, it's carbohydrate starvation. And I guess if you have a population of Japanese knotweed that's 10 by 10, that makes really good sense. You could actually, if there's open area, you could use a tractor with a bucket and just keep disturbing it. Anything that prevents top growth and forces that plant to use its energy reserves over time will get it. you just need to be diligent and you need to not give up. You all set, Billy?
I'm all set.
That was you that asked that, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm gonna, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna stop sharing and go back to my screen so I can see you. Oh my God. Maybe I shouldn't have done that.
So Randy, Andy had a question about Japanese barberry, whether you needed a permit. It sounds like you already answered that, but I just want to bring it around to that. Do you need a do you need a permit?
The only way you would need a permit is if it happened to be Wetland Protection Act jurisdictional. So if it happens to be within 200 feet of a perennial stream or river, you would be wanting to talk to your Concom. They may say, oh no, have at it. You can do whatever you want. But different Concoms are different. Some make a lot of sense and are very strict. Some are very strict and they don't make a lot of sense. Unfortunately, I see more often than I'd like to see is there are invasive plant projects that should be controlled and should be managed because the Conservation Commission, the Wetland Protection Act, is to protect a resource, being a waterfront or a wetland area. And if they're, because of the constraints they're putting on by not being able to do this and not being do this, some of them are just plain off mission. You know, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And they're actually not contributing to the overall health of that ecosystem near water. So if it's barberry and it happens to be near water, yes, you probably should get, I mean, the Concom, your first interaction with the Conservation Commission, you'd be asking for determination of applicability. That's where they come out and they say, oh yeah, this, yeah. And it sounds odd, but it's kind of like a COVID test. You're looking for a negative determination of applicability. Like on a COVID test, you want negative. A positive would mean that you would have to have a plan, put that would be your notice of intent is your plan. And then based on the plan, they would have a hearing and they'd say, yeah, you can do this, you can do this. And you would get the order of conditions, what's your permit. But Andy, if you have any specific questions about whether it's near water or want me to take a look and come up with a strategy for barberry for you, I'd be happy to do so, Andy.
Any other questions? Andy says you're a great American.
God, I try to be. I try to be.
Well, good.
Yeah, your presentation was very good. I learned a lot. Thank you.
It was great, Randy.
You know, I mean, I've been in weed science. 2022 will be my 34th year in weed science, and I'm really kind of feeling comfortable, like I know what I'm doing in the last 6 months. So you got me just as I start to really get good at this stuff.
Good thing we held off.
Yeah, I mean, I said, well, just give me a little more time. I'm slowly working into this. I had my bio says that a couple of years ago, they said that, the last thing, and they said, how many years you been in weed science? I said, 32 years. And so I started, I said, yeah, it's hard to believe I'm only 37. Must have started right out of kindergarten. A guy in the back of the room puts up his hand. And I said, what's up, Jimmy? He says, I just want to point out for 37 years old, you look like hell. I said, it's urban. I said, it's herbicides and being out in the sun that, and all the gray hair is a large amount of the client base that I deal with that has made me gray.
Okay. Any other questions for Randy? Hey, Randy, thanks.
This doesn't have to be the last. If you think of anything later. call
Yeah,
me.
no,
text me.
and I probably will, I'm sure, but it won't be tonight. Yeah, no,
How'd
this
I
is
do
good.
for this is my fourth presentation on Zoom today. So hope I held it together for you.
You'll earn your hat.